You know, most horror stories start with a scream or a dark, stormy night. But mine didn't. Mine started with a silence so perfect it felt like the world was holding its breath. Just the kind of morning on Blackwood Ridge that makes you forget for a second that civilization exists, where the only thing on my schedule was a mug of coffee and a routine check of the property lines. I've lived on this mountain for 20 years. I know every dip in the terrain, every twisted pine, every shift in the wind. So when I took the ATV up the North Trail, aiming for the high ground just to check for storm damage, I wasn't expecting to find a war zone. I wasn't expecting to find a crime scene. And I certainly wasn't expecting to find a luxury mansion sitting dead center on my land. It was jarring, like seeing a glitch in reality. One minute I'm looking at untouched wilderness. The next I'm staring at floor-to-ceiling glass, polished stone columns, and a wraparound deck that smelled of fresh resin and arrogance. This wasn't a shack. This wasn't a hunter's blind. This was a six-figure architectural flex that had popped up like a poisonous mushroom while I was busy sanding furniture in my workshop. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that screams trespass. So I pulled my GPS, checked the parcel overlays, checked the digital pins, checked them again. But the satellite data doesn't lie. This thing wasn't just over the line. It was half a mile deep into my territory, sitting there with the entitlement of a structure that assumes the owner is either dead or too stupid to notice. Panic is what they want. Panic is what makes you scream and bang on the door. But I didn't panic. I'm a retired state attorney, and 20 years in the legal trenches taught me that anger is just wasted energy, while documentation is ammunition. I walked the perimeter, boots crunching on the gravel they'd illegally spread, and I started noticing the details, the rush job, the lack of permits displayed, the way the silence felt abandoned, like the crew had packed up and vanished the second the last nail was driven. I called my wife, Sarah, told her to bring the drone, told her we had a situation, and when she arrived, she didn't gasp, she didn't yell, she just looked at the house, looked at me, and said, "Someone just bet their entire life savings on a map they didn't know how to read." Sarah is the kind of woman who can dissect a witness with a smile. So when she flew that drone up, we weren't just taking pictures, we were building a coffin for whoever built this house. The footage revealed the first crime: 3 massive stumps, ancient oaks that had been on this mountain since the Civil War, cut down to make room for a deck that looked shaky even from the air. That's when the cold rage hit me, the kind that settles in your gut, because you can rebuild a fence, you can fix a road, but you can't glue a 100-year-old tree back together. We needed heavy hitters, so I made 2 calls, one to Mike, a guy who operates an excavator like it's an extension of his own arm, and one to Old Man Russo, a retired structural engineer who sees the world in load-bearing ratios and stress fractures. When they arrived, the sun was high, illuminating the crime scene in high definition, and Russo didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight to the foundation, kicked the dirt, scraped away the loose fill, and looked up with a face that was pure thunder. "This isn't a house, Arthur," he said, spitting on the ground. "This is a gravity trap, shallow pour, no rebar, sitting on loose soil. If we get one heavy snow, that deck shears off and kills anyone standing underneath it." That changed everything, because now it wasn't just a property dispute, it was a public safety hazard on my land, and under the doctrine of abatement, I had the right, maybe even the duty, to neutralize the threat. I looked at the team, looked at the house that represented everything wrong with entitled money, and gave the order: take it down, piece by piece, document every screw, every beam, every failure. Mike fired up the excavator, the diesel engine growling like a beast waking up, and there's a specific feeling you get when you start dismantling a lie. It's not destruction, it's correction. Mike was gentle, feathering the controls, peeling back the roof like he was opening a sardine can, and the house groaned, a long, mournful sound of wood that was never meant to be there. But then, as the first wall came down, revealing the interior, something caught Russo's eye, a flash of metal hidden behind the drywall. Not a pipe, not a wire, but a safe, a hidden compartment built into the studs. We paused the machine, Russo pried it open, and inside wasn't cash, wasn't jewelry, it was paperwork, blueprints, expansion plans labeled Phase 2, maps that showed roads cutting through my forest, cottages dotting my ridge, a total annexation of Blackwood Ridge by the Silver Creek Estates Association. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a neighbor who got confused. This was an invasion, a premeditated campaign to steal the mountain 1 acre at a time. I was holding those plans, feeling the blood pound in my ears, when I heard the sound that always precedes a headache, the high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine forcing its way up a dirt track. A Porsche Cayenne, polished to a mirror's shine, crested the ridge, skidding on the pine needles, looking as out of place as a tuxedo in a slaughterhouse. The door flew open and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been manufactured in a factory that specialized in beige pantsuits and unearned confidence, followed by the kind of silence that usually happens right before a bomb goes off. She didn't ask what was happening. She didn't ask who we were. She just pointed a manicured finger at the excavator and screamed, "What in God's name do you think you're doing to my property?" I took a sip of my coffee, looked at Mike, looked at Sarah, and stepped forward. "Ma'am," I said, my voice low and steady, "I think the question is, what are you doing on mine?" She looked at me like I was speaking a dead language, her face twisting from confusion to that sharp, brittle rage that happens when reality dares to disagree with a narcissist's worldview. "Yours?" she laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a dishwasher. "I am Linda Sterling, president of the Silver Creek Estates Association, and I have authorization for this development. I have permits, I have rights, and you are currently destroying a $600,000 asset." Sarah didn't even look up from the drone controller, just said, "Your HOA ends half a mile downhill. Linda, your jurisdiction stopped about 3 tax brackets ago." Linda started vibrating, literally vibrating, clutching her phone like a weapon, screaming that she was calling the sheriff, calling her husband, calling the governor, calling God himself if she had his direct line. I told her to go ahead, told her to make every call she wanted because the signal on Blackwood Ridge is spotty and the truth comes in loud and clear. She was frantic, pacing back and forth in her heels which kept sinking into the soft earth, a perfect metaphor for her entire situation. But she managed to get a call through, and 10 minutes later, the reinforcements arrived, but not the police, not yet. A black SUV, massive, built like a tank, came roaring up the trail, tearing up the ground I try so hard to protect, and out jumped Robert Sterling, a man wearing a polo shirt tight enough to cut off circulation and a gold watch that cost more than my truck. He wasn't alone. He had 2 security consultants with him, guys with thick necks and dead eyes, the kind of hired muscle you bring when you want to bypass the legal system entirely. Robert didn't say hello. He charged straight at me, chest puffed out, shouting about lawsuits and jail time, trying to physically intimidate a man who's stared down murderers in a courtroom. "You're done," he spat, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. "You touch one more board on this house, and I'll bury you. Do you hear me? I'll bury you." One of the security goons lunged at Mike, probably thinking the guy in the excavator was an easy target, but Mike dropped from the cab with the grace of a dancer and the stopping power of a freight train, catching the guy's arm and twisting it into a lock that ended the fight before it began. Russo, who looks like a stiff breeze could blow him over, stepped in front of the second guy, utilizing some old military muscle memory to simply redirect the man's momentum into a pile of shingles. It was chaos, dust swirling, Linda shrieking, Robert tripping over his own ego, and Sarah's drone capturing every single frame of the assault from 40 feet in the air. That's when the sirens cut through the noise, the sheriff's deputies rolling in with lights flashing, and Deputy Harris stepped out, a man I've known for years, a man who knows the difference between a victim and a villain. Linda ran to him, playing the damsel, crying about how we ambushed them, how we were violent lunatics destroying her dream home. But Harris just held up a hand, silencing her with a look. "I need to see the paperwork," Harris said, looking at me. Linda thrust a folder at him, triumphant. "Here, the contract." He signed it. He agreed to the easement and the construction. I took the paper from Harris, looked at it, and almost laughed. It was a photocopy, a bad one, and the signature at the bottom was a pixelated copy-paste job of my signature from a public deed record. It didn't even have the pen indentation. It was the clumsiest forgery I'd ever seen. "Officer," I said, holding it up for Sarah's camera, "this is a digital artifact. This is fraud." And she just handed it to a law enforcement officer. The color drained from Linda's face, but she wasn't done. She hissed, "You'll pay for this." I'll have the EPA down here so fast your head will spin. I know people. And she wasn't bluffing, because the next morning, the EPA actually showed up, agents in windbreakers banging on my door, holding an anonymous tip about hazardous waste dumping on the ridge. My heart hammered for a second, because that's the nuclear option. That's how they bankrupt you, by burying you in federal fines. We hiked up to the site, and sure enough, there were barrels of solvent, bags of asbestos insulation, piles of trash that definitely weren't there when we left. Looks like a violation, the agent said, pulling out his ticket book, ready to ruin my life. But old man Russo just smirked, pulled a laptop out of his bag, and said, "You might want to check the timestamp on the wildlife cam I set up to watch the equipment." He played the video, and there it was, crystal clear in black and white IR night vision. Robert's SUV backing up at 2 a.m., two guys in hoodies dumping the barrels, scattering the trash, framing me for an environmental crime. One of the guys turned, and the logo on his hoodie, Silver Creek Estates, glowed in the infrared light like a neon confession. The EPA agent watched the video, looked at the barrels, looked at me, and closed his ticket book. "I'll be needing a copy of that drive," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And we're going to need to have a very serious conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Sterling about federal obstruction." We were winning the battles, but the war wasn't over, because Sarah, who had been digging through the digital trash while we handled the physical trash, found the smoking gun. An anonymous email, sent from a disgruntled HOA board member, a chain of messages between Linda and her contractor. "Just build it," Linda had written. "He's an old hermit. He won't fight back, and if he does, we'll use the reserve fund to drown him in legal fees until he sells." It was malice, pure and simple. It was intent, and in the eyes of the law, intent is the difference between a mistake and a crime. We printed everything, organized the exhibits, and prepared for court, not just to defend ourselves, but to drop the hammer on the most arrogant scheme Blackwood Ridge had ever seen. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old wood, that specific scent of judgment that usually makes people nervous. But as I sat there next to Sarah, I didn't feel nervous. I felt dangerous. Linda Sterling sat across the aisle, dressed in black like she was mourning her reputation, while Robert sat staring at the table, looking like a man who was mentally calculating how much alimony this was going to cost him. Their lawyer, a high-priced suit from the city, stood up and delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar, painting Linda as a visionary community leader and me as an unhinged savage who attacked a helpless woman's dream with heavy machinery. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Miller who didn't suffer fools, let him talk, let him spin his web, and then she turned to me. "Mr. Vance, your response?" I stood up. No lawyer, just me, because nobody knows the truth better than the man who lived it. "Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "I don't have a speech. I have evidence." We went through it like a demolition crew, methodical and ruthless. Exhibit A, the deed and the GPS data showing the encroachment. Exhibit B, the drone footage of the stumps, the theft of century-old timber. Exhibit C, the forgery, the fake contract that Linda tried to pass off to a sheriff's deputy. Exhibit D, the trail cam footage of the illegal dumping, the attempted frame job that backfired so hard it should have left a bruise. And then, the coup de grace, the email chain. I read it aloud, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "He's an old hermit. Use the reserve fund to drown him. Just build it." When I finished reading, the silence in that courtroom was heavy, physical. Linda was shrinking in her seat, actually physically trying to make herself smaller, while her lawyer closed his folder, realizing there was no move left on the board. Checkmate had happened 20 minutes ago, and he just hadn't noticed. Judge Miller took off her glasses, looked at Linda, and said, in a voice that was terrifyingly calm, "Mrs. Sterling, in 20 years on the bench, I have seen negligence, I have seen stupidity, but I have rarely seen such calculated, malicious arrogance." She didn't just dismiss their lawsuit. She scorched the earth. She dismissed their claims with prejudice, meaning they could never sue me again. She awarded me full legal fees. She awarded treble damages for the timber trespass, 3 times the value of those ancient oaks, which is a number that made Robert audibly gasp. And then, the kicker, she looked at the court reporter and said, "I am referring the record of this trial, specifically the forgery and the environmental dumping, to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Linda burst into tears, the ugly, sobbing kind, not because she was sorry, but because the consequences had finally found her. The gavel banged, a sharp crack that sounded like the end of a long, dark winter. We walked out of that courthouse into the sunlight, and it felt different. The air tasted cleaner. The fallout was swift. The Silver Creek Estates board held an emergency meeting that night and ousted Linda before the sun came up. The county redrew the maps online, putting a thick red line between my land and theirs. Robert lost his partnership at his firm pending the fraud investigation. But the real victory wasn't the money or the win. It was the barbecue we had a week later. We held it on the clearing where the mansion used to be, the ground now flat and healing. Mike was grilling ribs, Old Man Russo was drinking a beer and laughing, and Sarah was smiling, truly smiling. Deputy Harris even stopped by, off duty, shaking his head as he looked at the empty space. "You know, Arthur," he said, "you really kicked the hornet's nest." "Sometimes," I said, watching the fire crackle, "the hornets need to know who owns the tree." It makes you think, though, doesn't it? We live in a world where people with money think the rules are just suggestions, where they think they can pave over your life just because they can afford the concrete. I took that house down because I had to, because it was dangerous, but also because if I didn't, I was saying it was okay for them to take what was mine. But I want to know what you guys think. Was immediate demolition too extreme? Should I have waited for the courts and risked them squatting on my land for years? Or was tearing it down the only language people like Linda understand? Let me know in the comments. And remember, check your property lines, because you never know what the neighbors are planning. Stay safe out there.